Just start when you're ready.
Yes, I'm ready. So my name is Johan Rydlov. I work at the Swedish Transport Administration. And I'm going to talk about how we address pollinators today, and also on the challenges that we think we have regarding these questions. My background is I'm a biologist, working a lot with species knowledge back in the days. Nowadays I'm more a bit of a sustainability approach, but definitely looking down into biodiversity issues. I work a lot with constructing new infrastructure, and I also work a lot with strategies in a national scale. So pollinators. Well, for sure you could say that infrastructure has a great potential for pollinators. You could argue that road verges could be a really suitable habitat. And if you compare it to meadows or pastures in Sweden, actually more than a third of the total extent of the meadows and pastures, the road verges are equals to more than a third. So it's there's a great number of road verges, and if it would be a suitable habitat, we would actually increase the qualities in the landscape quite fast. You could also argue that grazed habitats are decreasing today, but road verges slowly increases in the landscape. And from a socio-economic perspective, you could argue that road verges are an unutilized environment. Well, but it's not that simple. There are some uncertainties if this is a good environment. There are definitely several mortality factors that can mitigate the habitat qualities that we look at. And we must make sure that there is no ecological traps. We don't want to attract pollinators into mortality factors that actually could decrease the abundance and the species diversity and so on. And we should also consider that there are several parameters here, and they're interacting. We could have different designs of the road verges, different managements, and then we have several different mortality factors that also could interact. So which is the most controlling factor? And there could be several different combinations. But if you look in literature, for sure, road verges can be really important. There are studies indicating that it's actually one of the most important habitats if you have a quite monocultural landscape. You can see for wild bees, it's a really important habitat. And if you look in a broader perspective, this is a study just looking on butterflies. You could actually look on protected areas and see that, well, they have a high species diversity in them if you compare it to areas around. And you can see that actually if you further away you get from the protected areas, you could have less species richness for the butterflies. But if you look on the long-term decline of butterflies, you could see that the decline is actually equal in the protected areas and the other areas around. So we need to address more values than just protected areas to actually address these questions. There are some studies looking on highways. You could actually see that they're totally barriers for some small insects. And I want to address that there are some conflicting values here that you have to look separately and then combine to actually address the real potential of infrastructure for pollinators. This study here shown that I think they looked at solitary bees mainly, and they could see that the populations of solitary bees were totally different in 5 sites along a big highway, and they could show it statistically. But some you could address that. Is it a barrier or is it fragmentation? I mean, this is a close urban environment, so maybe the fragmentation is quite big already. So if you put a highway in there too, the fragmentation gets too big. So it's hard to determine what's the barrier effect and what's the overall landscape fragmentation. But indeed, it's an interesting study. We know that there are mortalities along infrastructure and for sure along roads. And here you can see that if you have a more suitable habitat for pollinators, you get more mortality rates. But we also know that sometimes it's a real suitable habitat. If we restore road verges, we'll get a higher bee abundance and a higher bee richness if you compare it to a more weedy, high competition road verges with a domination of grass. So the most interesting and an open question, which we don't know so much about, is what is the mortality and the disturbance along a road? Well, there are definitely collisions, but how big is the impact? Is the annual average daily traffic important, or is the traffic speed important? I mean, traffic intensity or traffic speed? You could also argue that there are some disturbance in the area. Traffic noise is absolutely there and it could affect behavior from the insects. You could also argue for traffic-related harmful chemical substances. We have seen in other areas that chemical substances can do a lot for pollinator behaviors. If you look on the habitat, the management can be a really important issue. We have several different management methods in Sweden, for example, and internationally there are even more. And this is, of course, a part of safety along roads, also the longevity of the construction of the road, and then you could also address the question of ecology and for biodiversity. You could argue for pollinators that actually the design of the road side is important. I mean, how big will the habitat size be? A bigger habitat size could maybe be closing up to a threshold where you could actually be more beneficial despite the mortality factors. But you could also argue that you could keep a bigger distance to the traffic if the road verge is bigger. And then, of course, the type of soil you use and the slope degree could mean more warm conditions, more disturbance in the soil, and better beneficials for some plants. That's better for pollinators. We also seen in a couple of studies that the road verges is reflecting the landscape history, and it's more based on plant studies and the seed bank. But then in the other hand, you can also argue that the road verge itself would produce some quality for the landscape. So that's two different perspectives. In Sweden, we have something called species-rich road verges. They're marked out and linked, and we have a separate management in them, and they're also have a separate surveillance, so we have a focus on them and trying to preserve them. when we try to make improvements in the infrastructure, maybe bigger roads, you have to broaden them or something, but also to avoid getting invasive species, for example, inside those road verges. Here you can see a kind of a broader picture if you want to know how the distribution can look like. This is southern Sweden, and it's just it's not a satisfying picture of how long they are and stuff like that, but that's just where we have species-rich road verges today, which we are managing separately and with a focus for biodiversity. I mean, it's not that simple that the road verges should work just for biodiversity. There are several other areas that's really important. We have the geotechnical conditions for the construction longevity, and we also have the safety to take in consideration. But I think this is a good example of that you actually can create very different results in a project if you have different scopes when you start with. You see that they are quite closely related in the landscape in the middle of Sweden, these two road verges. And the first one, they obviously address that it's important for biodiversity. The second project, I think the geotechnical conditions was the most important because they had problems with landslides. But if they had addressed the questions a bit different, they probably could have placed a bit of sand or a very small soil layer over this rock layer, which is terrifying. When you look at it, it's really sad. It's not beautiful, and it's not ecological sustainable to build this way. For safety instructions, obviously the incline here could be important, and also the eyesight you can have, and what kind of vegetation you get in the road verge. We also have a lot of species-rich railway yards. I think we have several hundred of them, and they are really important. They have very often quite rare species of pollinators and flowers. And they also get this separate management as surveillance. It's a bit different from the road verges, but still it's an important environment. And mainly that's because there's a high disturbance in this area. You have to keep the vegetation very short because of technical solutions. Trains need vegetation-free tracks because of safety. They can't brake effectively, for example, if there's a lot of vegetation. So we have identified that to work efficiently with these questions, and we need science-based socioeconomic arguments. So we started up a scientific project last year, or this year. We're our first field season this year. And here you can see they are working in a road verge in the southern part of Sweden. This ongoing research project is involved with 2 PhD students, and they work. It's a network from Lund University and Landscape University in Uppsala. And the Swedish Transport Administration has funded half of this project, and we are definitely also involved trying to address questions that will be manageable for our administration in the long run. So this is broad landscape design studies, and we are trying to focus on the mortality factors. And how big impact they can have. The goal is to find when the benefits is bigger than the potential controlling factors that these mortality factors can be. And we are putting out colonies of bumblebees and solitary bees to have a control and to know and detect how different factors can impact them. And we weight them every week, and we're also taking pollen controls and wax controls for looking for chemical substances and stuff like that. It's an ongoing project, and there's still a lot of issues coming up, and we're working ahead all the way. But in the long run, I think this is, we've put a lot of hope into this scientific project, because we see that to have a sustainable infrastructure considering pollinators, we have to get some more questions answered. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Are there any questions?
Yes, it seems there is a specific question that says, have you measured pollution or microplastics from the road runoff to the pollinator habitats on the road verges, and or if it has any effects on the pollinators?
No, we haven't, and we have, at this level, we're actually more taking, we're searching for substances in the wax in the bumblebee colony. So we're not doing measurements in the rovers, but they are located in the rovers, of course, and are they're seeking for food in the rovers. So.
Yes, there was another question about pollutants, but I think that answers both questions. And someone is asking what kind of bumblebee species you are using in your research.
I don't remember at the moment. I'm sorry. If you mail me, I will answer.
Yes, it's probably terrestris, I think.
Yeah, I think it is terrestris. Yeah.
They're usually the ones being used in the name of science. Are there any last questions before we move on to the next panelist? If you have time to stay, Johan, if there are any questions in the chat later, if you're able to answer them as the course goes on, that would be great.